Welcome, everybody, to this live edition of the Time for Impact podcast with myself, Chris Wade, and my co-host is also here, Matt Cobble. Hi, Matt. How are you today?
Hi, Chris. I am good, thank you. Really looking forward to discussing these topics today. I'm really excited that we've got lots of people joining us on the panel today, which we'll hear more about soon, and people listening in on this as well. So, looking forward to a good discussion about volunteering again.
And as this is being recorded for the first time in front of a live audience, which I'll explain a little bit more about in a second, our audience, if you want to join in the conversation, you can use the chat function to type in a question or even some thoughts that you have, and Matt and I would do our very best to weave some of those conversations into our wider conversations if we're able to multitask sufficiently to do so. So please do join along in the chat function. As I say, this edition got an audience invited by NAVCA along to the session. And NAVCA is, of course, the national membership body for local infrastructure organisations in England. NAVCA members, many of which are joining us on this live podcast, support their local voluntary and community sectors, and NAVCA provide them with resources, support and networking opportunities like today to bring their members together. For Volunteers Week this year, NAVCA, with its members, co-produced a guide to inclusive volunteering, which you can download from the website. And that guide is very much an inspiration and a springboard into today's discussions. But I want to introduce some of our guests first of all. So first of all, we have Holly Notcutt from Volunteering Matters, an organisation that I've admired for some time, way back when they were community service volunteers. Shows my age and how long I've been in the sector. Welcome, Holly. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I am the head of strategy and coordination for the I Will movement, which is all about youth social action, really. So young people and their role in shaping society and supporting communities through volunteering and wider youth social action.
And we've got Debbie Sadler, who's head of delivery and programs at Unlock, a brilliant organisation working with and for ex-offenders. Hi, Debbie. Nice to have you here.
Yeah. Hi, Chris. Really excited to be here. Yeah, great podcast. So looking forward to hearing other people's thoughts as well.
Let's hope this edition's as good as whatever you've heard in the past. And Ciara Devlin, who is the CEO of Breaking Barriers, again, a brilliant organisation, particularly working in with refugees and asylum seekers. And we're really keen to have your input as the discussion evolves. Hi, Ciara.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Chris. Thanks for that. And thanks for saying my name correctly, because I know it's not easy. My very first podcast, I have to say. Just to say quickly about Breaking Barriers. So we are an employment charity and we support refugees into meaningful employment. We're actually currently celebrating our 10-year anniversary. And we support refugees through providing advice, guidance and support. We also have relationships with over 100 language schools who provide scholarships to English language courses. And we provide support around requalification. But a big part of our model is we work very closely with the private sector to open opportunities into employment for our clients.
Good stuff, really important stuff, and I will come back to some of that, I'm sure, as we go. What NAVCA have asked us to focus on as we progress our conversation is particularly about how do we make the voluntary sector and how does infrastructure bodies help the voluntary sector be much more inclusive when it comes to volunteering? How do we get more people involved in volunteering, but how do we actually make it a much more welcoming and attractive and valuable experience for those people who come along? And we've invited our speakers, particularly because NAVCA members have said these are areas where they feel like could do with some particular help to really make their volunteering more inclusive. So hopefully that will be the sort of framing for our conversation as we get forward. And so I guess maybe I'll kick things off in terms of maybe even almost looking at it in the sort of life cycle or way people get involved in volunteering. We do all the best stuff in the world to make our volunteering inclusive, but if we're not marketing our volunteering in a way that's attractive to people, then we're going to be found. And we only have to look at time well spent and barriers to volunteering from the DCMS and so on, and we can see that there are lots of ways, lots of things that get in the way of those groups who are represented here today, but other groups in actually getting involved in volunteering. So I wonder what our esteemed colleagues around the table here have to think about, what can the sector be doing better to actually get people interested in volunteering in the first place? Go for it, Debbie.
Yeah, hi everybody. A really interesting question. But I think for us, it's really the starting point is very much language, isn't it? That use of inclusive language. Because for Unlock in particular, we often hear the term ex-offender, and that really describes somebody by their offence. And often people have moved on from that, and they want to be described as a person. So a person with a criminal record, rather than the thing that links them back to a time that they've moved on from, and they now want to be included and be part of an organisation. Things that we often see, where application forms state a criminal record might not necessarily be a barrier. Well, the presumption is that it is a barrier. So I think thinking really carefully about the language we use and using that very welcoming language, welcoming approaches, providing, that is an organisation's genuine approach to being fully inclusive. So I think that's a really, really important starting point.
Debbie, that's really relevant to the work that we do, and I know that there's such crossover in terms of the particular areas that we work in terms of the barriers, for want of a better word, that we are trying to break for our client group. And you mentioned language, you mentioned application forms, and the application process in itself can create such barriers for our client group. So it's inclusive language, simple language, taking the jargon out of a lot of those kind of tools to try and reach people. But even the process, having people fill out forms, or the application process, there are other creative ways that potentially organizations could be thinking about doing that. A lot of what we talk about when I was thinking about this was, obviously our focus is employment, and it's so parallel to the way we talk to our partners around how do they make their recruitment more inclusive. It's completely in parallel to volunteering, because it's providing opportunities for people to come in and, from a volunteering perspective, to engage in a community, to integrate, to build their skills. And so there's a huge amount around what we talk about now as inclusive recruitment processes that are so relevant to the volunteering world. In terms of what the infrastructural organizations could do is bring us together more, is provide those opportunities maybe to bring us as organizations working with these client groups together, and reaching out into our clients so that they're aware of these opportunities. Because I think one of the other challenges we have with our clients is they're not always fully aware of what volunteering is, or that they even see it as an opportunity, because they are so hell-bent on having to get work and find the financial means to survive. But actually volunteering brings so much value to them in terms of building their skills and their experience, but also meeting people, practicing their language skills. And they don't always know that they can get access to expenses paid, all those bits and pieces that we take for granted, that we understand, that would help.
That's almost sort of saying that it's okay making the actual application process more accessible and so on, but actually you're going right back to actually need to know that volunteering is an option, and a potential option in the first place. Yeah,
I think going back to knowing that volunteering and social action is an option, but not just relying on our kind of marketing and communications. Of course, that's really important for us when we are kind of inviting young people into the movement. We want every kind of young person involved. So young people who have got refugee and asylum seeking backgrounds, young people who've got experience in the criminal justice system, young people from a whole host of kind of standpoints and backgrounds. But obviously, if we're not platforming young people with similar experiences, we know that it's difficult for some people to feel that this opportunity might be for someone like them. So I guess making sure that our communications, whether that's our website, our social media, or a wider kind of digital kind of platforms, are as representative as possible of people from a whole range of standpoints, but also making sure we don't rely on that solely, thinking, well, we did all this advertising and still we've got the same kinds of people getting involved. And I think a key thing that we've seen progress, and we're not perfect, but we're definitely getting better, is when we've really empowered the young people that are involved in the movement to go out and bring other people with them. If they've had a good experience with us, if they're enjoying what they're doing, if they're feeling the benefits of their social action and volunteering with us, then we sort of hand it over to them and say, you will know someone else in your community who's doing some great stuff. They might not be the natural person to put their hand up and step into this kind of place, let alone, struggling with the application process. So you invite them in, you invite them to a conversation with one of us, and that might be really time consuming to do that really ultra personal approach, but in the long run, I think it kind of pays off in droves.
Yeah, and there's something kind of empowering about that as well. I suppose, we can spend loads of money and time as organisations reaching out to loads and loads of new people and doing it in most inefficient ways possible. But surely the word of mouth, but also learning from the individuals, the lived experience of the individuals that you're working with, and not just using their contacts, but also using their knowledge, I imagine, and their experience is really kind of critical.
Just to jump in on that, Holly, I completely agree. We spend so much time and effort thinking of innovative and creative ways to reach people. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but let's use the people that we have not at our disposal, but we've engaged. And we certainly find, even in terms of our services, a lot of it is self-referral or people going out into their communities and talking to each other and recommending us. But also I wanted to take that further and say, look, how are we valuing them? How are we making those that we have engaged feel valuable, in that using, asking for their feedback, asking for their suggestions, asking for their ideas, and actually then taking those and moving those, getting their insight into how we can reach more people within their own communities and others. And I think that's really helpful for us, but it also makes people feel valued and that their voice is heard.
And we often work there'll be a whole mixture of people on the call and an even bigger mixture of people listening, but a lot of people will be working for reasonably large or formally organised volunteering organisations, which will have some processes in place that may or may not work really well for older populations, for different populations, and it's quite difficult to tailor those application processes, those onboarding processes, whatever they might be, to a whole variety of audiences. Yet if we don't, and we know from all the statistics that we see, if we want to widen involvement in our organisations, we need to do things not just in different ways, but in probably lots of different ways at the same time. I don't know if you've got any advice for organisations who are trying to invite a whole diversity of people into their organisation who will need different approaches.
For us with young people, we just sort of echoing what we've already kind of said, definitely that personal touch. It's the most time consuming one, but it is, I think, the most sustained and the most kind of comprehensive way to welcome people in, and certainly for the long term. But when it comes to sort of the more general application processes, if you like, we just try and make sure as much as possible that it's straightforward, that it's clear. Yes, there are those things that we have to capture to satisfy the demands of our kind of funders and investors, and to also make sure that we're accurately monitoring and understanding who is in our kind of community of young volunteers and ambassadors, which is obviously really, really important to make sure we are as diverse and as inclusive as possible. But just making sure that there's a few different ways. So we perhaps unsurprisingly have a way of people writing an application, 3 kind of really simple questions that helps us get a flavour for people, rather than people feeling that they need to list a load of skills and accolades and awards. More about their passions and their motivations and a time that they feel like they've helped, or things like that. But we also encourage voice notes. We have a way to sort of submit a voice note that you would do on your phone, if that's certainly a way that I communicate quite a lot. And then also just sort of like a recording yourself on a video. Not everyone's kind of cup of tea, but definitely is an option for some people who perhaps struggle with written and like to have a bit more of a visual kind of approach. And it's not hard. I think if you've got an online process, a digital process to do your application form anyway, it's quite easy to submit a voice note and set up a video. Less easy when you've just got paper, obviously, but then maybe just coming in for a chat and a cup of tea.
Sure.
I don't know how many organisations look for references for volunteering roles. I imagine many do, and often that's a real barrier. And so what we do, our advisors act as referees any of our staff who know our clients can do that. But it's also ensuring that they know they can use, it doesn't have to be professional contacts. It can, it can be or other individuals that they know who are willing to kind of give them a character reference, if you like. So that seems really simple, but it can be such a barrier. I think the other piece was a bit like the sales pitch. So from an organization's perspective, we're looking for volunteers. We're very clear on what we need from them, but what are they getting in return? And I think there's something around, again, in very simple language, what are those individuals going to gain from volunteering for your organization? And I know that they will gain so much, but let's make that really clear, especially to people who've never done it before, who don't maybe fully understand why they would do it. We know it's valuable, and so let's communicate that really clearly.
I wonder if it's been really interesting to hear about like marketing approaches, making the application process as kind of easier to access, more streamlined, sort of overcoming some of those barriers that it feels to me are quite kind of potentially easy to overcome if we engage with people who are looking to apply and understand the things that could really be putting them off, or the things that would motivate them to get involved a bit more. It feels to me like one of the other things that potentially could be a barrier in terms of sort of involving more sort of diverse groups of people as volunteers is, and it feels to me like one of the more sort of persistent barriers, sort of sector-wise, I suppose, is the issue of organizational risk appetite. Like often my sense is it's not volunteers always who are the issue. Sometimes organizations' own perceived risks about involving different people to their traditional base in terms of volunteers. And things I've sort of experienced in the past are things like safeguarding risks, fear of sort of getting it wrong as well. So not just good intentions, but worried about just doing it wrong or doing it in the wrong way. I suppose my one of my reflections on this is like, what are these risks really? Are these risks real risks? Are they evidence-based? Are they assumptions? And also are there opportunities we're all actually missing by sort of playing it too safe? I'd be really interested in the panel's views on, when it comes to involving more diverse groups of people as volunteers, what are the risks anyway? Are they real? Are they perceived? As leaders of volunteers, how can we help organizations feel more confident and comfortable taking risks to open the door a bit more?
Yeah, I think that we really should try to break down this stigma and really challenge the harmful sort of messages that are being set out by the media or politicians or whoever, because I think we need to really shift the public perception and make people realise that whether you're a refugee or you're a person with a criminal record, whether you've been through the care sector, you're a person first and foremost, and maybe try to normalise that. And rather than starting from a sort of the safeguarding perspective, just think about the positive change that people make. Think about the things that people actually bring to an organisation because of their own experiences. So really shift the narrative, I think, from risk to potential, because people have huge amounts of potential. And when you really drill down into this sort of the risk, and is it a risk to my organisation? I think that's a perceived risk, because if you actually speak to people that are working within an organisation, and there have been lots of surveys done on this, they actually want their organisation to be fully inclusive. They don't have a problem with working with people that are different or from a different background, and they see it as a real positive. But I think that they're the leaders, leaders, trustees, whoever, actually have this real concern about this. So maybe there's a bit of work to do about, training our leaders and our trustees to be a little bit less risk averse. And I think we need to really challenge that sort of culture, and especially around the people that we work with, as to charities often based on recruitment and volunteering on, this vision of sort of respectability, or sort of that assumption that you've got to be a certain sort of person, and those things are the things that we need to recognise and challenge the definition of professionalism and trustworthiness.
And presumably there's a difference between, even if you do take the opposite approach to yours, Debbie, and you do look at the risk, there's a big difference between managing risk and eliminating risk, or accepting risk, etc. And there are choices to be made there. It's not always about let's get rid of risk at all costs, is it?
Yeah, and sadly I think a lot of organisations want to eliminate all risk, and you can never do that. So I think, if you've got a process in place where you can take a really seasoned approach to risk assessments. And as you say, Chris, putting mechanisms in place that can mitigate against some of those. What you often find is you get real buy-in from all of the organisation. So the things that are seen as a risk, if you can communicate that you've put things in place, that becomes less of a concern.
Yeah, loving all of that, Debbie. Totally agree. I think the other thing that you were making me think of as you were talking was about the actual kind of opportunities that organisation, I mean, it sounds a little bit extractive actually, but like the opportunities the organisation can benefit from by taking a risk on somebody. So it made me think of some of the young people that we have welcomed into our ambassador community who've said, actually, I've got these significant life challenges, whether that's SEND, neurodiversity, kind of extreme mental health problems and so on. And I think we've never once said that someone couldn't come in, because every time we've seen it as an opportunity and spoken to that person, asked them about what it is that we can do that would help them to undertake their role in the best possible way, what adaptations we can make to the role. And we've got things wrong, and there've been mishaps, but that's where we've really learned about what we could do better next time, and then we're able to put things in place going forward. So I think sometimes there's a feeling like, let's get everything in place and get the risk assessment as watertight as possible so that the risk is minimized with this risky person. Whereas actually, if we, like you say, take a human approach, get to know them as an individual, understand the sorts of things that they need to be able to have a good experience, and then what we would need, but then take an approach collectively that this is a journey where we're all going to learn, and we might not always get it right, but what we will always do is try, and what we will always do is communicate, and what we'll always do is work to build trust so that going forward we can all have a better experience. And I look back over the last few years and think, actually, we're doing so many things better because we've tried and tripped over and picked ourselves up and tried again and then got it right. So if we can shift that to being a benefit to organisations, then hopefully that will help to improve that appetite, as you sort of said, Matthew.
Feels like there's something in there about sort of being brave enough to try things and not being scared of kind of getting it wrong, and working with your community to get it right, whether that's involving people in all kinds of ways, right? I'm sure there's particularly in the volunteering space, right? We often talk a lot about we make the best decisions when we involve people and we work together. We'll hopefully come on to that in a bit later on, but it feels like if we take that as a principle, actually that can help us feel braver about tackling some of the risks maybe around this. And there's risks involved in anything, right? With any aspect of involving volunteers, and we make decisions about that all the time. And it seems to me it's important to keep that in proportion and check. And the people who can help us do that are probably the very people we're trying to involve, maybe.
I completely agree, Matt, and with what everyone said, but I think what gets to me is the labelling, and it's coming back to Debbie, some of what you've been saying around language, and these are people, and I've certainly felt that coming into the refugee sector. I've only been in the refugee sector for a year and a half, and I came from the homelessness sector. So similarly, this labelling of people by their life experience, that I struggle with that a bit. So why would we look at somebody who's got the label refugee? Why would we look at them differently to any other person who wants to come and volunteer for us? And so there's something there, and it ties in with what everyone has said. What's obviously you've got to be realistic, but you've got risk with anyone. So why would you, make sure you've got the right process in place for anyone who wants to come to your organisation, but also it's an opportunity to educate yourself. So use resources, use organisations like ours, like those on the panel, to find out more, to understand what those individuals come from their perspective, what they're coming with, and what are the challenges they're facing that you can be aware of. It's just an opportunity for learning, as a few of you have said.
It's interesting, like it feels to me like there's a broader point here about sort of treating people as people, and and being respectful, and really getting to know people as people rather than as labels. And it seems to me that starts to speak to a broader point about culture, which feels to me probably another kind of real kind of key component of involving people as volunteers. And I wonder, like, we can invest potentially a huge amount of time in marketing really well, in attracting new people, in making our recruitment processes really easy to access and things like that. But our organizational culture can potentially kind of eat our recruitment strategy for breakfast, so to speak. And, you know, I'd be really interested in views on this, but the kind of thing, there's bringing volunteers in, right? But there's also retaining people and there's keeping people. And my sense a little bit is like the biggest influence on whether someone stays or leaves is not really the application form, but is the kind of culture they walk into, the welcome they get, whether they feel useful, whether they feel like they belong in that environment. And there can be a whole range of barriers to around that. But I'd be really interested in your views on what do you see as the kind of key building blocks for creating a culture that really fosters sort of a warm welcome for everyone, where people feel valued, and what steps should we be taking to sort of breaking down some of the cultural barriers that might make people feel less welcome? It feels like we've started to touch on some of that already.
Yeah, I think I think at risk of sort of like repeating ourselves, it's definitely about that personal touch as much as possible. So whilst you might have most organizations will have an induction kind of pack or a you know, onboarding day or things like that, which are really, really important to understand the organization. I think there's just something about how we can pay attention to individuals, the things that they like, the things that they said that they were interested in when they applied. I think you can't measure it, but there's something about how people are made to feel. And if they're made to feel like you care about them, that you're interested in them, that you think that what they're doing is valuable, then I think they'll feel much more able to hang around, at least for a bit and hopefully for a long time. I also think that where possible, and it's probably easier on a local level, but where possible, opportunities to bring people together can make people go from being a individual contributor to feeling part of something bigger, where they've made connections and started to form bonds with people that perhaps they might not have otherwise met, and even if they had met, might not otherwise realize that they had something to connect on. I think that kind of speaks to the broader agenda around cohesion and inclusive communities more broadly, because actually in a time where othering and division is rife in our society, the most important and powerful thing I think we can do is create as many opportunities as possible for people to meet other people, see their neighbours as human beings, seeing someone different as part of their community. And you can only do that through creating the conditions for people to come together and to connect. So I think where possible, if we can do that, and sometimes that's online, where possible, if we can do that, I think that's huge around creating a culture of inclusivity, connectedness, and creating a feeling of belonging to one another and to the organisation, and hopefully to the wider community too.
Yeah, so that sort of thing about shared purpose. I think as volunteer managers and professionals, we inherently think that all the answers sit with us, I suppose. And we've already discussed how, you know, actually people can bring their own input into shaping their volunteering and so on. But I also wonder whether, you know, without being negative, sometimes volunteering can be quite cliquey, and you already get established teams of people who, with no malice whatsoever, are doing it because they like socializing with their friends and they built up that, you know, a really good bond, and it's a really positive thing. But sometimes breaking into that from the outside, whatever your background and whatever your situation, is really, really difficult. And I wonder what we need to do as organizations to help maybe build better intergenerational volunteering, for instance, or what else we need to do just to allow people to feel that they belong as much as the people who have been there for 20 years, that their contribution is equally valued, even if they're doing something different. And I wonder if you've got any lessons from your organisations that you would suggest that other organisations could adopt to make sure not just that the staff are addressing these issues, but actually volunteers know that even by accident, they may be actually affecting how inclusive and how valued and how welcome people feel in their organisations.
Yeah, I think, you know, most organisations have, as Holly was saying, you know, some sort of induction process. But I think when we're talking about people that have these sort of additional barriers, I think a lot of organisations think that they somehow need special treatment or a special induction, which then is like, it's almost fearful about, so they're going to get something extra, and that's really scary, and we don't really know what that means. And I think for us, we've always assumed that everybody's different. every volunteer that comes to you is going to be different, and some will need really quite a lot of support because the people that we speak to often have got a lack of confidence, their self-esteem is shot to bits because of their experiences. And so we try to have as light a touch as we can at the beginning, just until we really identify what people might need. And that can be just palling somebody up with like a mentor within the organisation, somebody that they know that they can go to, somebody that they can raise some concerns with, that it doesn't feel like they're raising concerns with a volunteering manager, but their pal that they can just chat things through with. And I think that there's a real benefit in that. And stories, I think, tell a real story. You know, if you can share, or you can get some of those people that are volunteering with you to share their own experiences. What was it actually like? How were you made to feel? Because it's not us telling people that this is how we're going to make you feel. We don't know how people are going to feel. It's hearing from the individuals. This is how this organisation made me feel. So I started at this point, but hey, after time, this is how I felt. This is what they did. This is how they made me feel included. Because I think it's difficult for us to say that, because what we perceive we might be doing isn't necessarily somebody's actual experience of that.
That's about two-way processes and communication loops and so on, I imagine. How about others? Any tips for the rest of the sector?
I mean, I would say even just being aware of it is a start, recognizing that there are these cliques. Chris, I know exactly what you mean. I've been in that situation where I've gone to volunteer and felt very excluded because of the people that have been there for so long are all mates. And that's why they came together to do it primarily. I think from an organization's perspective and a leadership perspective, being aware of it. And yes, that doesn't mean you can go in all guns blazing to try and get rid of it, but just be aware of it to be able to have the conversation and start to think about ways to address it. Because I think sometimes people don't realize they're doing it if they're excluding people, or they do. But, you know, that's a whole other tactic. Being aware of it is progress, because I think often organizations aren't.
It seems to me sometimes some of the things that make sort of tight-knit teams quite successful at doing stuff can also be the things that create biggest barriers for bringing new people in, sort of thing, or expanding. And it's a common thing I've heard in volunteer involving organizations almost across the board, from like local community-based volunteer groups that are doing a fantastic job in their local community, but basically will say sort of a version of, well, no one else wants to volunteer. And we've been trying to bring in new volunteers, but no one else possibly wants to volunteer. And you sort of, from a sort of outsider's perspective, you sometimes look at that and go, yeah, I can sort of understand why someone else might not want to get involved in this setup here, because you're so close. You're doing so much great stuff, understandably, but it's not necessarily conducive to bringing people in who are not used to operating in that way, or perhaps don't see themselves fitting in that, in that way of working. And I wonder if that brings us on to another topic about, I suppose, the changing nature of volunteering a little bit. I'd be interested in your thoughts on this one, which is a lot of the research at the moment seems to highlight this notion that COVID has accelerated a lot of trends in volunteering, sort of that we were seeing already. We're seeing increasing things like digital is here to stay in some respects. We saw around COVID things like the rise of mutual aid, quite a different form of volunteering outside of sort of formal structures necessarily. We're seeing a rise and increase in things like social action, which is happening in different ways, whether that's things like Extinction Rebellion or other kind of causes being taken up that are important to people's hearts. People are joining movements sometimes and not organizations. For others, looking for more flexible, bite-sized opportunities. It was interesting. I was at an event recently where someone basically said, I'm not sure micro-volunteering exists anymore. It's just volunteering. And for years, we've talked about, all these different kinds of volunteering, but is it actually time to accept that is just volunteering now? It's 2025 and volunteering is a broad church. And we need to accept all of these different forms of involvement as volunteering, which I suppose brings me to my question, which is like, how do we reconcile the fact that people want to be involved in new ways, and we might need to involve people in new ways to reach different groups of people who've not traditionally volunteered? How do we get that to work well with the kinds of people who lots of organizations involve at the moment in quite a traditional way? How do we get those two different things to coexist well? I'd be interested if anyone's had any thoughts on that or any experience of it. or even what you think the challenge ahead might be for that?
Just an initial thought, I guess it's flexibility, typical question, typical response, but having that, really, really trying to be as flexible as possible in terms of the kinds of opportunities that you can offer individuals depending on what their time capacity is and what their skills are. But see it as an opportunity. Don't see it as a negative that actually you can bring in people for short periods of time to do specific pieces of work voluntarily. So, and really utilizing their skills, I think that absolutely should be seen as an advantage. What we see with the volunteering that we offer is we go in, so from the kind of partnership perspective, when we go into companies that partner with us, we run employability workshops with our clients coming in and the workforce. And that's just an afternoon. That's volunteering for somebody who wants to really engage. Alternatively, then they can become mentors. But again, it might only be for 3 months. It's up to them. It's up to what capacity they have, and what their needs are. But we've got to match that with the needs of our clients. And equally, that works. It's not always as simple as that. But I think it's about you seeing it as an opportunity to be. We have become a much more flexible world. The online aspect of all of this means that there's always a way, I guess. Yeah.
I totally agree with that flexibility. So I think during COVID, when everybody started to work remotely, we'd always had very traditional volunteering, that people came into our office and they volunteered in our office. And we had to work very differently. And we're seeing this right across the board, aren't we? Where people get used to working from home. So, it was really difficult then to settle into, right, so okay, so the world's back to normal now, COVID's over, let's all come back to the office and work in that way. Because that didn't suit everybody. People were able to do things from home. And so I think that flexibility is important, but also braveness, because I think for us, we get lots of people offer their services and they want to volunteer, but they can't, as you said, Matt, they can't volunteer in the traditional ways. So it's looking at short-term pieces of work, short-term opportunities. And sometimes that takes a real leap of faith, because you're having to look at things that historically you've never done. And you've got to be prepared to think, well, this could work really, really well, and this could be a great opportunity, or it could fail dismally. And then we would have to have a look at how we reworked it. So, getting feedback and seeing how we could make it work if it doesn't. So I think, flexibility and braveness.
Just to add to that, I suppose, I think there's something about what it is that we can offer in terms of our volunteering opportunities, how they can be more flexible and dynamic, and could be one afternoon or 1 year, whatever it might be. But how can we also kind of relinquish our power a little bit and just say, actually, volunteering is a great thing, no matter where you do it, no matter how you do it. And it doesn't have to be with us, in our organisation, in our movement. If you're doing something to help somebody else, that is important, it matters, and that can be, quite literally life-changing. And so I think sometimes there's an issue with how we articulate volunteering, how we recognise it, and how we value it. And I wanted to share a quote, which I do kind of use quite a lot, but I think it really helps to sort of illustrate this a little bit. So it's by this incredible feminist author in the USA called Patricia Hill Collins, Black feminist author, and she wrote this quote, which is I'm just going to read it. It says, a white college student from a private college goes into a poor neighborhood and volunteers for 4 hours a week, and that's considered exemplary. Whereas a poor kid who lives in that community and takes care of all of the kids in that neighborhood for 4 hours every day is not seen as a volunteer. And so if we've got that kind of framing, which no one's kind of doing it deliberately, but that's what we've kind of inherited, then we'll always kind of be stuck, I think, with this we need to make our volunteering opportunities more, and it's important that we do try and make them more flexible, and we need to be offering them. There's absolutely a place for that, and really, really important, but we have to be bold enough to kind of let go a little bit and say, you know what, you don't have to volunteer with us, because doing what you're doing in your community is absolutely, changing lives, probably is the most transformational stuff that you can do. And so we need to not only encourage that and let go of people coming to us, but just say, do it, go out and do it wherever you are, step out of your front door and start to say hi to somebody. But I think importantly, we need to attribute some value to that, look for it, see it, spotlight it when we see it, so that people don't only feel valuable when they come to us and get their lanyard and and get celebrated via our schemes and our infrastructure. So I think we've all got a role to play in that somehow, in terms of how anybody, young people, anybody in society can volunteer to really, really make a difference.
And even within our organisation, Shimmery Holly, there's something about, you talk about losing control, sharing power. There is something about moving the focus and narrative onto a shared purpose. We're trying to achieve something rather than a shared activity. Instead of the focus of volunteering that we need to do the X, Y, and Z, the more we can shift on to actually, this is the general bigger picture we're trying to achieve. We'll help you find your way of contributing towards that, which makes your time, your background, your interests, your skills, your lived experience, whatever it might be, and being more facilitators, and the word that Matt and I use a lot, curators of volunteering experiences so they can find their own solution. If you can do that, surely that's always far more empowering and more inclusive than saying we need somebody who can come along and give us 5 hours a week, 5 days a week, doing a certain task under supervision. How it looks like. And I think that's where we circle back, don't we, to some of the co-production lived experience conversations that we started with. But all these things take resources and effort, and somebody in the chat has mentioned it also takes cash, not always, but often takes cash to be able to try these things, try new approaches, to trial and fail sometimes needs funding. Have you come across, or have got any ideas on how we can really start to help, but often very, very small organisations find ways to involve people in a more inclusive way and get the resources, the training, the help, the marketing, whatever it might be, to be more inclusive in terms of how they can reach out for Debbie?
Yeah, I do understand the whole fear and the concerns about having money and resources. But I think, like a lot of organisations, Unlock is small. We are a small, tiny charity, and we really don't want to grow. We value the use of volunteers, and it's really difficult. But I think that not everything needs money, and a lot of the time we pilot a lot of things that we do with the thinking that actually this might evolve into something much bigger. So an idea doesn't have to be huge at the start. That might be where you want to end up, but actually you can do things in a much smaller way that involves far less resources and far less cash. And I think the majority of organisations, we're all working a sector where we're all up against funding and money. We're used to doing this stuff. I heard somebody say yesterday at a conference I was at, charitable organisations, we can't rely in our sector, we can't rely on the MOJ or the Home Office to do a lot of the things that we're asking for. So the charitable sector, whatever sector that is, we need to be the A team, and we need to do this stuff ourselves. And we certainly are used to doing those things. Every one of these organisations that are here listening today are used to doing this stuff. So yeah, sure. You don't have to be right at the end of the journey. You can do things in bite-sized chunks, I think.
Sure, resourceful bunch. Right, we're running very, very late on time. So I suppose the last little question for each of our panelists from me is, if you were to give 2 tips to those listening in, so with regards to making the world of volunteering more inclusive from your perspective, what were the 2 things, the most important things that you would ask that that organisations try to do?
I guess the most immediate, and we've talked about it already, is ask your existing, ask for feedback, ask your existing volunteers what makes them do what they do for you. And you can use that data, use that evidence to, even in terms of what were the things about the organisation that were good and what were the things that weren't. And if your volunteers are coming from a very diverse community, which ours are, what are the elements of how we approached you or how you approached us that kind of led you to us? And so just use what you've got to hand, and just really, again, it's so simple, but just really communicate what somebody's going to get from volunteering for you. Be really explicit about that, because we often focus so much on what we need rather than what people can get from the experience.
Fabulous. Thank you.
I think my 2 tips are, first one is to ask ask people to come and join you. I always think about when I was at school, I didn't do Duke of Edinburgh because I thought you had to be in top sets because everyone in Duke of Edinburgh was in a top set. And so I was like, well, I can't go to Duke of Edinburgh because I'm not in all the top sets. Actually, I would have loved it. I love, as an adult, I love the outdoors, I love adventure, all these sorts of things. And I really wish someone had asked me and encouraged me to step in, because that would have been the difference. So I think if we can ask people and encourage them to come in rather than just waiting for people to come to us. And I think the second thing, which kind of links back to what you were just saying a second ago, Debbie, is about giving things a try. So just because it's not on the project plan, just because it hasn't been identified, just because we haven't got funding for it, if someone's got a good idea, then let's say, sounds good. Like, what can we do about that? Like, let's have a think. What can I do? What can you do? What can be a really, really helpful first step? Because I think when it comes to social change, which is what we're all trying to do, social change doesn't come from a master plan. It never has, and it never will. It comes from lots of little groups of people with ideas, passions, and visions, doing lots of little things. And then cumulatively, that's what ultimately makes change happen. So I think someone's got a good idea, give it a try.
I would agree with everything that Ciara and Holly have said, and I think the stuff that we've talked about all the way through. I guess it's, for me, maybe thinking about working with other grassroots organisations so that we're just not looking at where we historically find our volunteers from or how they find us, and listening and getting that lived experience view, because you can't go wrong.
That's a good note to end on. And thank you to all of you for giving up your time to join the podcast and sharing your pearls of wisdom in our conversation. And hopefully that's either directly or indirectly got our listeners thinking about some tangential ways in which they can apply your thinking to their organisations, and we can get far more diversity and much better inclusion in volunteering as we go forward right across the sector. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Bye.
And thank you for everybody who's joined us live and listening. It's been really nice to have an audience for a change rather than just talking amongst ourselves. So thank you for joining us. And a big thank you to Emily at NAVCA for helping us bring this episode together and source such wonderful guests for our conversation.